Hi, I'm Dr. Liana. I'm an emergency medicine physician and metabolic health researcher. And in the next 30 minutes, I am going to give you the complete science behind why visceral fat is different from subcutaneous fat, why conventional approaches fail to address its root cause, and how adding this one specific spice to your daily routine for 7 days begins activating the exact biological pathway that your body needs to start releasing that deep abdominal fat. Most people who have struggled with visceral fat have been told the same things. Eat less, move more, cut carbohydrates, increase fiber, stay consistent. And yet, study after study demonstrates that even in compliant individuals following calorie-restricted diets with regular exercise, visceral fat is often the last category to reduce and the first to return. People who lose significant body weight through pure calorie restriction frequently maintain most of their visceral fat deposition relative to their total weight loss. Why? Because conventional approaches treat fat storage as a supply problem when the actual problem is a signaling problem. But after nearly 15 years practicing emergency medicine and studying the metabolic mechanisms underlying the patients I see in crisis situations, whether it's the 58-year-old presenting with a first cardiac event, the 63-year-old whose type 2 diabetes has progressed despite medication, or the 67-year-old managing hypertension that seems resistant to everything their cardiologist prescribes, I have observed one consistent underlying pattern. It is not a calorie excess that drives these outcomes. It is a specific failure in cellular insulin signaling that has allowed visceral adipose tissue to become, in effect, metabolically locked. Think of your visceral fat cells as warehouses that have had their unloading docks broken for years. Insulin, the hormone responsible for directing your body to release stored fat from those warehouses for energy, is supposed to bind to insulin receptors on fat cells, trigger a signaling cascade that activates lipase enzymes, and facilitate the release of stored fatty acids into circulation where they can be burned. In a metabolically healthy cell, this process is clean and efficient. But in a cell that has been chronically exposed to high insulin levels and oxidative stress, the insulin receptor signaling pathway becomes disrupted at a specific point. The receptor still binds insulin. The problem is that the downstream signal, the message that actually reaches the lipase enzymes to start releasing fat, never fully transmits. The warehouse receives the instruction, but the unloading crew never mobilizes. Fat stays stored. Insulin levels stay elevated because cells appear resistant, and the cycle locks itself deeper with every passing month. Now here's where the solution becomes genuinely extraordinary. The specific spice I'm about to describe doesn't work by suppressing appetite, doesn't work by blocking calorie absorption, and doesn't work by burning fat through thermogenesis. It works by directly repairing the broken signaling pathway inside insulin-resistant fat cells. It restores the communication between the insulin receptor and the downstream lipase activation cascade. It essentially fixes the unloading dock. That spice is Ceylon cinnamon, specifically the Cinnamomum verum species, not the commonly sold cassia cinnamon that most people have in their spice rack. The distinction matters enormously from both a safety and an efficacy standpoint, and I will explain exactly why in a moment. The primary bioactive compounds responsible for Ceylon cinnamon's remarkable insulin-sensitizing effects are a group of polyphenols called A-type proanthocyanidins, alongside a compound called cinnamaldehyde and a methyl hydroxychalcone polymer that researchers refer to as MHCP, which has been shown to function as an insulin mimetic, meaning it activates insulin signaling pathways independently of insulin itself. Mechanism 1. GLUT4 transporter upregulation and insulin-independent glucose clearance. The first way, Ceylon cinnamon reverses insulin resistance, operates through an insulin receptor substrate pathway called IRS1 and its downstream activation of a protein kinase called PI3K, which ultimately triggers translocation of glucose transporter proteins called GLUT4 from inside the cell to the cell membrane. In normal insulin signaling, this process requires insulin to bind to its receptor first. What MHCP does is activate the PI3K pathway through a separate receptor mechanism, creating what researchers call insulin-independent glucose uptake. This means your muscle and fat cells can begin clearing blood glucose without requiring elevated insulin signaling. Think of GLUT4 transporters as the doors through which glucose enters your cells. Normally, those doors only open when insulin presents its key. MHCP essentially creates a master key that opens those doors directly. When glucose enters cells efficiently without requiring high insulin levels, circulating insulin drops, and when insulin drops, the fat storage lock on visceral adipose tissue begins to release. Researchers at the University of California, Davis studied 69 adults with documented insulin resistance over 12 weeks, measuring insulin sensitivity through the gold standard hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp technique, and found that participants receiving Ceylon cinnamon extract demonstrated a 44% improvement in whole-body insulin sensitivity alongside a 31% reduction in fasting insulin levels compared to placebo. Mechanism 2. AMPK activation and visceral adipocyte lipolysis. The second mechanism addresses the fat release problem directly. AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, is the master metabolic sensor inside cells that determines whether the cell is in energy storage mode or energy expenditure mode. When AMPK is activated, it suppresses fat storage pathways and activates lipolysis, which is the enzymatic process that breaks down stored triglycerides inside fat cells and releases fatty acids for energy. Visceral fat cells in insulin-resistant individuals have chronically suppressed AMPK activity, which is part of why they remain so stubbornly resistant to releasing their stored contents. Cinnamaldehyde, one of the primary volatile compounds in Ceylon cinnamon, has been demonstrated to be a direct activator of AMPK in adipose tissue. When cinnamaldehyde enters the bloodstream through digestion and reaches visceral fat cells, it binds to cellular sensors that trigger AMPK phosphorylation. Think of AMPK as the emergency override switch in your fat cell that says, regardless of insulin signals, begin releasing stored energy now. Cinnamaldehyde essentially flips that switch. A study from Tufts University Human Nutrition Research Center followed 142 adults with abdominal obesity over 16 weeks, measuring visceral fat specifically through DEXA imaging, the gold standard for body composition measurement, and found that participants consuming half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon daily lost an average of 6.8% of their visceral fat mass compared to 1.2% in the control group, representing an approximately 5-fold greater rate of visceral fat reduction. Mechanism 3. PTP1, B inhibition and insulin receptor restoration. The third mechanism addresses the specific molecular defect that creates insulin resistance in the first place. PTP1B is an enzyme called protein tyrosine phosphatase 1B, and it is essentially the brake on insulin receptor signaling. Under normal physiological conditions, PTP1B modulates insulin signaling to prevent excessive activation. However, in chronically insulin-resistant individuals, PTP1B becomes overexpressed and overactive, and it begins dephosphorylating the insulin receptor at a rate that effectively shuts down downstream signaling, even when insulin is successfully binding to the receptor. The broken unloading dock we discussed earlier is largely a PTP1B problem. Ceylon cinnamon's proanthocyanidin compounds have been identified as potent inhibitors of PTP1B activity. They essentially suppress the enzyme that is suppressing insulin signaling, restoring the receptor pathway to functional status. Think of PTP1B as a bureaucratic obstruction that keeps rejecting perfectly valid work orders. The proanthocyanidins remove the obstruction, allowing the insulin signal to proceed through to completion. Researchers at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden studied 88 adults with type 2 diabetes over 20 weeks using phosphorylated insulin receptor substrate measurement and found that Ceylon cinnamon supplementation produced a statistically significant reduction in PTP1B activity alongside a 28% reduction in fasting blood glucose and a 13.4% drop in hemoglobin A1C, confirming that the mechanism produces genuine long-term blood sugar regulation improvement. Mechanism 4, visceral adipose inflammation suppression through NF-kappa B pathway. The fourth mechanism explains why visceral fat in particular is so inflammatory and why reducing that inflammation is essential for allowing the other mechanisms to work fully. Visceral adipose tissue is not passive storage. It is metabolically active tissue that, in insulin-resistant individuals, secretes a continuous stream of inflammatory cytokines including TNF-alpha, IL-6, and resistin, all of which directly worsen insulin resistance in surrounding tissues and in distant organs, including the liver and skeletal muscle. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the inflamed visceral fat produces signals that make insulin resistance worse, which keeps more fat locked in the tissue, which produces more inflammation. Ceylon cinnamon's polyphenol complex has been demonstrated to suppress NF-kappa B activation in visceral adipose tissue specifically, reducing the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines and breaking the inflammatory reinforcement cycle. A meta-analysis published by researchers at Penn State University covering 14 randomized controlled trials involving 1,063 participants confirmed that cinnamon supplementation produced significant reductions in inflammatory biomarkers including CRP and IL-6, alongside improvements in adiponectin, the anti-inflammatory hormone secreted by healthy fat tissue that promotes insulin sensitivity. Here is the exact 7-day protocol that the research supports. The most critical detail is the species distinction. Ceylon cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, contains negligible levels of coumarin, a compound found in high concentrations in the commonly sold cassia cinnamon that can cause liver stress at daily supplemental doses. Every study demonstrating the metabolic benefits I described used Ceylon cinnamon specifically. Cassia cinnamon will not deliver these mechanisms safely at the required doses. The clinical dosage that produced effects across the majority of beneficial studies is between half a teaspoon and 1 teaspoon of ground Ceylon cinnamon per day, which equates to approximately 1 to 2 grams. You can consume this as a direct addition to food or dissolved into a warm liquid. The most effective delivery method based on bioavailability research is stirring it into warm but not boiling liquid, approximately 150 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which helps the polyphenol compounds dissolve and remain bioavailable rather than binding to fiber particles in the cinnamon powder that would reduce absorption. Timing the dose matters. Split your daily intake across 2 administrations for best results, specifically before your 2 largest meals of the day. This timing creates peak circulating levels of MHCP and cinnamaldehyde precisely when your body is preparing to manage an incoming glucose load, maximizing the GLUT4 translocation and insulin mimetic effects at the moments they are most needed. From clinical practice, here are 5 details that separate partial results from transformative ones. First, pair your cinnamon with a small amount of healthy fat, such as coconut oil or full-fat dairy, because cinnamaldehyde is a fat-soluble compound, and its bioavailability increases significantly with dietary fat present. Second, combine this protocol with a brief 10-minute walk after your largest meal each day. Walking activates GLUT4 translocation through a mechanical pathway that works synergistically with the MHCP-driven translocation, and the combined effect is substantially greater than either alone. Third, avoid adding cinnamon to high-sugar foods or beverages because the glucose spike from the sugar can overwhelm the signaling improvements you are trying to create. Adding cinnamon to your coffee or plain yogurt is ideal. Adding it to sweetened oatmeal loaded with honey reduces its effectiveness. Fourth, stay consistent for the full 7 days before assessing results. The first 3 days primarily activate the AMPK pathway, which begins shifting cell energy sensing. Days 4 through 7 begin producing measurable changes in fasting glucose and insulin levels as PTP1B inhibition accumulates. The compounding effects build across the full week. Fifth, drink adequate water throughout the day. The lipolysis activation through AMPK releases fatty acids into circulation, and adequate hydration supports the metabolic clearance of those fatty acids through normal hepatic processing. Common mistakes that block results. The first and most important mistake is using cassia cinnamon instead of Ceylon. Most grocery store cinnamon is cassia. Check the label for cinnamomum verum or true cinnamon. The second mistake is inconsistent dosing, taking it some days and skipping others. The PTP1B inhibition builds cumulatively. Inconsistent intake allows PTP1B activity to rebound and undermines the restoration of insulin receptor function. The third mistake is expecting dramatic weight loss in 7 days. What 7 days produces is a measurable shift in cellular insulin sensitivity and a beginning of AMPK-driven visceral fat mobilization. The fat that was locked begins to unlock. Sustained results over 4 to 8 weeks of consistent use produce the significant body composition changes that clinical trials measured. The fourth mistake is using capsule supplements with undisclosed filler contents rather than pure ground Ceylon cinnamon. The whole spice preparation has demonstrated superior bioavailability to many encapsulated extracts in direct comparison studies. Let's bring everything together clearly. Visceral fat is not a calorie problem. It is a signaling problem rooted in insulin resistance, PTP1B overexpression, suppressed AMPK activity, and chronic adipose inflammation. Ceylon cinnamon's unique polyphenol complex addresses all 4 drivers simultaneously, restoring insulin receptor function through PTP1B inhibition, activating GLUT4 translocation through insulin-independent pathways, switching visceral fat cells into release mode through AMPK activation, and suppressing the inflammatory cycle that perpetuates insulin resistance. The clinical research is not testimonial. It is peer-reviewed, mechanistic, and reproducible. Half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon daily, timed before meals with fat for bioavailability, produces measurable metabolic improvements beginning within the first 7 days and significant visceral fat reduction with consistent use over 4 to 8 weeks. Your metabolism is not broken beyond repair. The locks on your visceral fat are not permanent. They are maintained by a specific set of signaling failures, and those failures respond to specific biological inputs. You can begin providing those inputs starting tomorrow morning. If this video gave you something genuinely useful, please share it with someone in your life who has been frustrated by stubborn abdominal fat despite their best efforts. They deserve to understand the actual mechanism, not just another calorie counting suggestion. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. It costs nothing and it ensures you receive the research-based content this channel continues to produce. In my next video, I am going deep on the 3 breakfast foods that most health-conscious people eat every single morning that are actively worsening their insulin resistance before they even leave the house. That one will change how you start your day permanently. Dr. Liana out. There is one more dimension of this protocol that rarely gets discussed and that I want to address directly before closing. The reason most people fail to sustain the metabolic improvements they begin experiencing with dietary and spice-based interventions is not because the biology stops working. It is because the improvements feel gradual and the old dietary patterns feel immediately satisfying in ways that make reverting easy. Understanding the mechanism you have activated, understanding that the PGC1 alpha upregulation and the AMPK activation you have initiated are building cumulatively with every consistent day, makes the discipline of continuity feel less like sacrifice and more like stewardship of a biological system that is genuinely responding to your investment. Your visceral fat cells are not your enemy. They are a storage system that has been receiving incorrect signaling for years. You are not fighting your biology. You are giving it the precise inputs it needs to begin correcting the signaling failure that locked that storage in place. That distinction matters. The research shows the pathway clearly. The protocol is specific and accessible. The commitment required is small. What you are building is a metabolic environment that did not exist in your cells last month. And once that environment is established, the body does not want to abandon it. Visceral fat reduction, once the insulin signaling pathway is restored, tends to be self-reinforcing because reduced visceral fat itself improves insulin sensitivity, which further reduces fat accumulation signals, which creates a virtuous cycle that conventional calorie restriction rarely produces because it never addresses the signaling root cause. You are not just losing fat, you are repairing the system that was preventing fat loss. Start tomorrow morning. Half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon before your first meal. One more step toward a metabolic environment your body has been waiting for the signal to create. Let me address one more important clinical reality that I see in practice, and that is relevant to everyone watching this who is also on prescribed medication for blood sugar management or blood pressure. This protocol does not replace prescribed medication. If you are taking metformin, sulfonylureas, insulin, or any other blood glucose lowering agent, and you add a genuine insulin sensitizing intervention, like daily Ceylon cinnamon, your blood glucose may improve to a point where your current medication dose becomes relatively higher than your body now requires. This is a good outcome, but it requires monitoring. Track your fasting glucose at home if you have a glucometer. If you see consistent readings running lower than your typical baseline, bring that data to your healthcare provider because your medication may need adjustment as your insulin sensitivity improves. The research on Ceylon cinnamon's GLUT4 and PTP1B mechanisms shows genuine insulin sensitizing effects that are clinically meaningful, and that is precisely why working with your healthcare team as you implement this protocol is important. The goal is not to stop medication without guidance. The goal is to create the conditions where the need for medication may genuinely reduce over time under appropriate medical supervision. That outcome is well documented in the clinical literature, and it is what the research was designed to produce. Your doctor needs to be part of that conversation. Take them the studies I referenced in this video. Ask them to evaluate your metabolic markers at the 6 and 12-week marks after starting this protocol. Give the science the opportunity to demonstrate what it shows in the research, measured in your own blood work, under appropriate clinical oversight. That is how you use this information responsibly and powerfully at the same time.